Welcome, everyone, to the third installment of the Colorado State University Prevention Extension Cast. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Nathaniel Riggs. I'm a professor of human development and family studies and director of the Colorado State University Prevention Research Center. So I'm very happy to be joined here today by Dr. David MacPhee. He's a professor emeritus in human development and family studies here at CSU, and is actually my next door neighbor in the office at the Prevention Research Center. And that's when we used to go into the office, I guess. Dave is going to be here for a conversation on effective community-university partnerships. So I'll give you, by way of introduction for Dr. MacPhee, his prevention research focuses on family strengthening programs to promote effective child rearing and resilience, family-school partnerships to promote parent engagement and school success, and more recently, community-driven change involving civic leadership and positive youth development. And one of the things that's really great about Dave's work is that a common thread across all of these research interests is operating from a diversity lens and promotion of resilience. And Dave just has such a long history of really working effectively with community partners in his engaged work and his community-based participatory research. So thank you all again for joining us today. And thank you, Dave, for joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. I'm a little bit nervous about being live on TV here, but no, I'm doing fine. Thank you. It's Friday.
Sounds good. Yeah, happy Friday, everybody. So let's just dive in. So the first question, I always like to kind of ask a grounding question, a defining question. So for those of you in the audience who might be new to the topic, Dave, can you tell us what community-university partnerships are?
Sure. When I thought about that question, it's a multifaceted perspective on it. So I'll give you at least three perspectives on what defines that. One more generally is attention to this knowledge practice gap. That relates to the fact that prevention science aims to generate knowledge that's intended at least to meet communities' needs and challenges. So that's on the prevention science side. And then in terms of practice, that should inform theory. So there's a feedback loop there between generating knowledge and then applying it back to theory and practice. So this is the perspective of integrated knowledge translation. It focuses on kind of the researcher knowledge user partnership. That particular integrated knowledge translation came out of a lot of evidence that's accumulated around evidence-based programs not really being more widely implemented. And why is that the case? There's a lot of science around what works, but it doesn't get applied as routinely as we might want it to. So that led to a lot more attention about what do we need to know about the community aspect of how they're implementing evidence-based programs, and how can we use that to more effectively serve constituents. Another perspective is one from Extension. I've worked with Extension folks for 35 years on some really fulfilling projects, both from the prevention science perspective and the community one. And I just want to read you what Extension's focus is, at least as it is defined in the newer mission statement here in Colorado. That mission statement focuses on impact, empowerment, and systems, those three things. And the impact part is catalyzing innovative science. So in a bit, I'll talk about some of the basic research that I've been able to do through collaborations with Extension that provides a feedback loop to strengthening the community's impact. Part of the empowerment aspect of Extension is engaging diverse communities, and Nate mentioned that as one of the foci of my research for all of my career, pretty much. And then the systems component of Extension's focus is in part facilitating innovative collaborations and networks. So in all three of these aspects of Extension's focus, there is attention to the underlying applied science for that work. And then lastly, I've been doing program evaluation for decades, and when I teach the graduate class on prevention program evaluation, I talk about what drives me in terms of evaluation. I'm a goal-directed evaluator, but I'm also an empowerment evaluator, which means working with community members to empower them to advocate, to demystify evaluation, to teach them the skills that they can then use in doing evaluations on themselves. So I try and work myself out of a job in some ways in terms of empowering community members. And I want to leave this question with a wonderful quote to me in terms of the way I think about evaluation. Why community partnerships are so valuable in solving complex wicked problems is what this relates to. A partial solution to a whole system of problems is better than a whole solution to each of its parts taken separately. And for me, this really feeds into the necessity of adopting a systems perspective when we're working with community members. They know the local scene very well, much better than I do as an academic applied researcher. I have a good handle on the theory and the methods. It takes those two combined to really address systems issues, even if we're only getting part of the problem. So answer that first question, and your next one leads into more concretely some examples of the ways that communities and universities can collaborate, and some examples from our own partnership. I hope I'm not stealing your thunder, Nate, with that question, but
you're just showing how unnecessary I am to this whole process.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. I'm glad I feel needed. So I generated a laundry list here of examples of ways the university and communities can collaborate. Most of these are folded into the Prevention Research Center and are all represented by our collective work in the Prevention Research Center. So I don't know that there's a linear list here, but one aspect of community university collaborations is around needs assessments. In my own work, my first needs assessment was in collaboration with the local health district. They wanted to do a fairly comprehensive needs assessment. Unfortunately, they had the money to do it. So we did a widely distributed needs assessment here in Larimer County. And then one of the student groups in my graduate evaluation class did another needs assessment under my direction, where they collaborated with the health district again around some health-related needs in Loveland, a neighboring community where CSU is. And then currently I'm really deeply invested in a statewide community needs assessment through Extension that I'm co-leading with an Extension person here on campus. And that's been a multidimensional, very exciting initiative where we have developed a guidebook for local extension agents. This is consistent with that empowerment evaluation approach, where we're walking them and scaffolding them through the process of collecting social indicator data, survey data, focus groups, key informant interviews, and then using all of that synthesized information to guide their strategic planning. So it's truly a state level, local level, university collaboration around a needs assessment. Very exciting and interesting work, and I think it'll be really helpful for the local communities. Program evaluation is another aspect. I know of community university collaborations, and I've been doing that with Extension for more than 30 years. First with what's now an evidence-based program, the Dare to Be You program, a two-generation family strengthening program that was initiated by the Ute Mountain Ute tribe in the Four Corners area. And it has been a foundation for, in particular, a lot of my equity work, equity inclusion, because Dare to Be You has consistently worked with a wide range of ethnic and socioeconomic groups. And then another turning into long-term program evaluation aspect of mine is the Family Leadership Training Institute that I've been working with for the last 8 years. Patty Schmidt in Extension is a statewide, I wish I could remember her formal title, but she is the director of the statewide program. And I've been evaluating that in collaboration with her and the local sites for a long time. One thing I got to say that blows me away about both Patty Schmidt and my collaborator on Dare WU, Jan Miller-Heil, is their amazing networks. That's something I've come to appreciate as an academic researcher. Is I wouldn't say it's a deficiency of mine, but I've ended up relying a great deal on their networks in the applied work that I do. So that's another aspect of the collaboration. It's been very beneficial. Grant writing would be another form of collaboration. Virtually all of these kind of innovative programs with the evaluation piece have involved collaborative grant writing. I can't recall writing a single grant, at least in terms of these community programs and projects, that didn't involve community partners. Definitely around the theory of change and the logic model, which I always teach in grant writing is the fulcrum of writing applied grants. And then my extension collaborator will usually then take responsibility for the curriculum part and the service delivery, while I'll take on the theoretical background and the evaluation component. But they are truly collaborations where we learn from each other, inform each other, send drafts back and forth, that kind of thing. Nate and I and the Prevention Research Center are currently talking with the local United Way about creating workshops for community partners around grant writing, evaluation, that kind of thing. Some, kind of basic, I wouldn't say basic, but technical aspects of collaborations that will help them in their service delivery and getting grants. Program development is another area where I've typically taken a secondary role because I really aim to keep my evaluation component separate from the program development part, and especially the delivery, because it's a conflict of interest. But I have been doing a lot of brainstorming with Patty and Extension around tweaking the Family Leadership Training Institute for an on-campus aspect of that. We've got a grant that's been submitted for that. It in part addresses town-gown relationships, which is another form of community collaboration. Been involved in formative evaluations through extension of innovative programs we're trying out, especially around positive youth development. There's a entity here in Colorado, the Colorado Clinical and Translational Sciences Institute through University of Colorado. And I'm sort of a fill-in principal investigator on that one because the previous one left for another job. But we're doing a lot of program development using focus groups to support new dads. And it's a collaboration with the local women's center, a couple of pediatricians. So it's another town gown kind of a thing. Training and instruction. So I've taught a couple of courses through extension endeavors about program evaluation, for example, service learning courses, both the grant writing class that I used to teach and Nate does now, as well as the prevention program evaluation class, or a service learning class where we connect students through United Way to community agencies who would benefit from those collaborations. So that's part of training and instruction. And in my experience, those grant writing experiences and the evaluations are very much co-constructed with community partners. The students, the collaborating agency, and I think I'll get a lot of benefit from that. Technical assistance, which the Prevention Research Center is really launching more of that. We're still in, I think, the somewhat early stages of that, but tailor interventions for local nonprofits. I've been doing that lately. The Civic Capacity Index, which I can dive into in a little bit more depth later, is intended to be a needs assessment for local communities where they would then seek technical assistance from the PRC or other agencies for implementing community level changes that promote civic engagement and community resilience. A lot of work around dissemination. So I have written articles with various folks in extension around how to find and use evidence-based programs, Journal of Extension articles, Patty, another collaborator, David Crislip, and I just are having an article published in Rural Connections around civic engagement, community-driven change, and resilience. Monitoring the time here. Informing policy. So in the past, I have given testimony to, this is a weird one, but my very first master's graduate focused on surrogacy, and we gave testimony to New Jersey and New York legislators around surrogacy policy. Lately, last month, or it was in July, I guess, Patty Schmidt and I presented to the Fort Collins Futures Committee on reimagining engagement as well as equity and inclusion. Those are two of their 20 priorities. And then the last one on this is just basic research. I am fond of doing collaborative intervention work because it tells me about whether my theories of change are actually supportable or not. So I've done some work around in collaboration with Extension folks around ethnic differences in social networks, for example, which is a feedback loop into providing support programs that might have to be tailored for different groups. Gained insights about why some graduates of Family Leadership Training Institute were not as successful in implementing initiatives, and that led me to look at grit or perseverance as a possible contingent variable for explaining the effects of the program. So that's my laundry list, probably the longest one that I've got, Nate. So I'll turn it over to you for the next question. I promise the next ones will be a bit shorter.
All right, just shows us that we got the right guy on the webcast today.
All right.
Thanks for all those great examples, Dave. I really appreciate that. And I also want to, before I ask the next question, I want to make sure that everybody knows that they take full advantage of the chat on your right there, the chat bar. Say hi to everybody. It looks like we're troubleshooting some technical difficulties as well, but we can take care of that too. But what we'll also do is we're going to save the last 15 minutes of our conversation today for Dave to answer any questions that emerge for you all as he is talking about his work. So please feel free to ask those questions in that chat bar, and I'll monitor that, and I can relay those questions to Dave. So yeah, thanks, Dave. You talked a lot about some of the bidirectional flow of information as being an advantage of community university partners, and that really these true partnerships with communities really they enhance the translation of the work to our community partners, but then the community partners also inform the type of strategies and the approaches that we need to be thinking of as researchers. Can you tell me, what are some other reasons that universities or that the communities should engage with universities and vice versa in these types of partnerships?
Yeah, part of it, I think, is Extension's mission, again, in terms of advancing and deepening the impact of science, that kind of thing. So that is more maybe the benefit on our side. But academic applied researchers basically must test their hypotheses out in the real world, and that often involves service delivery, program delivery, that kind of thing. I think another benefit is just the networking with a lot of assistance from my partners that we've forged. I've learned a lot about community capacity building through those collaborations that they have. So again, that's a benefit on my academic side. This is another bidirectional one. I think we applied researchers are more familiar, I know we are, with what criteria there are for an evidence-based program, how to access them, how to use them, the training requirements for them, that kind of thing. So that is a skill set that we bring to the table. But practitioners, could use some guidance occasionally on how to implement those evidence-based programs, which means effective training. So there's benefit there. They're learning how to deliver these evidence-based programs. It's important, I think, also to work with representatives of existing programs, including public schools and extension, in order for an evidence-based program to be taken to scale. So that's come up a lot in the literature, especially Dick's both. I'll leave it there. There's a question here that relates to it. How would a community organization explore a potential partnership with the university? That is, I think, a really big question, and sometimes the problem is that that matchmaking, the speed dating, if you will, between the applied researchers who really want to reach out to potential partners and the partners wanting the research base and information, some guidance on evaluation, that kind of thing. It's been really a challenge, at least in our campus, to figure out how to do that. We've got several committees and groups on campus trying to smooth that approach out and figure out how to do that. Just so at least the matchmaking occurs and we can figure out what's the capacity in terms of partnerships. I'm only speaking for myself here, but at least from my experience, we're all looking for opportunities to collaborate with communities. The difficulty is trying to find kindred souls who have, similar interests, like in my case, family strengthening or community capacity building or whatever. I know I've referred Nate, for example, to some potential collaborators in the education field around school engagement. So it seems a little bit catch as catch can right now. A problem still we're working on, I guess. Mm-hmm. But anyway, yes. Yeah. See, Patty, that would be my collaborator there in terms of the Office of Engagement and Extension. So we're working on that. Do you want to have me address more questions or go to the chat?
Let's, yeah, I can ask the next question. And you mentioned extension a couple times, and one of the great things that I really appreciate about Colorado State, and then my graduate work at Penn State, and I know that we have a couple of folks on the line from Penn State and Washington State who are that are both land grant universities as well, is the land grant mission of CSU, and I'm wondering if you see any particular role for CSU and other land grant universities in fostering community university partnerships.
Yeah, again, that's I think there are feedback loops there, and they need to be cognizant of our different specialties and how they can align in that work. So I would tend to say that I'm well versed in solutions that are based on theory, prior research, and methods. Those three things. My toolbox is, and I'm very upfront in my collaborations, my toolbox is often around the methods of evaluation, alternatives to randomized controlled trials, implementation science, that kind of thing. And I learned very quickly to acknowledge the community practitioners are typically more aware of emerging issues that require the research insights. They're much, much more familiar than I am with the local needs, community assets, potential solutions that are workable or palatable to clients. So I really need them to help shape my evaluation, and we need to collaborate on those two different perspectives in writing grants in particular. Community buy-in and family engagement are essential to a program success, and I absolutely rely on the folks in Extension for their understanding of how that can be enacted, the community buy-in and family engagement. I'm critically dependent on folks in Extension for help with recruitment and retention. I've had some marvelous brainstorming sessions with my Extension collaborators around, it's one thing to recruit participants, but what does the research say about how to retain them? A lot of good stuff out of the Oregon Social Learning Center about that, but they also have some lived experience and professional experience that is very informative about how to recruit and retain, especially underrepresented groups in our programs. And so practitioners are essential to those efforts. I think I've answered a lot of most of the other parts of the question when I was talking ad nauseum about my work with extension. Those would be other concrete examples, but I would say fundamentally we need each other in a lot of ways.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Dave. So when we're talking about community university partnerships, some can be very effective and maybe some not as effective or productive. What would you say are the best practices in community university partnerships? And I guess how would you define a successful community university partnership?
Yeah, I hadn't thought about the last one other than the proof being in the pudding. And sometimes failure can be informative as well, as I think we've all probably learned. So this is kind of a laundry list from the literature, but my lived experience, I guess, would support a lot of these, and working with folks in extension. The first one would be to establish trust, and that's based on transparency. Are there any hidden agendas? Get them on the table. Are we being used for someone else's benefit? And that's often more on the side of the collaborators in the community who historically might have felt that they're being just used for the benefit of the academic researchers on campus. And I've gotten that feedback, and I think it's understandable. Am I just another token in this process without any real decision-making power in the collaboration? So I think all of those issues can be elephants in the room, and it really is important to build trust through transparency. Open discussions are part of that trust building process about, resolving mistrust, broken promises, exploitation. That's been talked about in the literature, how fundamentally important open discussions are in building trust. And I will say, sometimes there's a power differential, maybe often there is, with we academic applied researchers and our multiple degrees perhaps having more power. And so for me, it's been cultivating, very careful listening, being, I guess I would say, one down sometimes in order to have an open discussion that builds trust, acknowledging those power differentials. A common agenda or a shared vision is critical for a successful one. Again, that requires a lot of conversation. One thing I've found really interesting in the literature about collaborations, university community collaborations, is how important improved quality of life is to that. That puts on a co-equal basis our community partners and the academic researchers, like knowledge generation, promotion of learning. A lot of authors have argued that these research collaborations need to be based on community needs and contributing to the betterment of the community. So that's been a driver of my collaborations, is wanting to serve others, improve the quality of life, that kind of thing. And fundamentally, I'm dependent upon my collaborators for that. This one's a thorny one, developing shared language and a shared understanding. There's a lot been written about that. One of my favorite examples of this is there's a 2004 book by Jason and colleagues. They provide a lot of examples of how a Research 101 workshop for community partners could be helpful in demystifying the research process. So there's a shared language and a shared understanding. And co-equal with that would be a parallel Community 101 workshop that would be held for the researchers, so that we researchers are partners in a kind of a bicultural language. So we understand each other's perspectives and language and concepts and stuff. A shared worldview has been emphasized, and I get that completely concretely. Both of my long-term extension collaborators and I have talked overtly about our shared systems perspective on systems change and how we go about doing that. So we have a shared worldview there. Similarly, a shared valuing of equity and inclusion and getting people to the decision-making table that typically do not have that opportunity. We're also self-reflective in thinking about what's working and not, and being open-minded about, well, that didn't work, let's try something different. So in those ways, we've had a shared worldview that's really made the collaborations helpful. Commitment to action plans that are describe mutually reinforcing activities. That's been a common thread in my collaborative work anyway, and it seems to pop up in the literature is not just doing talk, but what are we going to do about this? How are we advancing the quality of life in communities? And often a shared measurement system, an MIS, comes up in collaborations that are effective. So our efforts remain aligned, partners hold each other accountable. We build in a feedback loop so that we're monitoring the progress we're making on the evaluation side, on the service delivery side, that kind of thing. And if any of you are interested, I've got a lot of resources here that have concrete guidelines on building relationships with community partners. One of my mantras is nobody leaves my office without a book or an article, so I'd be happy to, at least share those references anyway. And then on the flip side, Nate's going to ask me about barriers to successful. So
yeah, we have yeah, Mark in the chat read our minds. So thanks, Mark. Okay. I'm assuming that's Mark Winokur, our building mate. So.
All right. Yeah, so these are some things to be attentive to. Several of them relate to our very different either cultures or environments we live in and sort of the expectations of those environments. So going back to that mistrust and trust issue, history can be something that would be an impediment to a collaboration. Broken promises and mistrust, exploitation. I would say this often happens where those in the academic arena, maybe unknowingly, but still break promises, promise a report and it doesn't happen, which I have done. I got in deep dog trouble one time for being delayed in an important evaluation report, and it was justified. My department had intervened on that and set me straight on how important it was to keep promises to our collaborators. Knowledge production, ownership, and intellectual property, all of these kinds of things are part of a history that we may have to overcome and build in a collaboration, or that can torpedo a promising collaboration. This thing, sectoral diversity and coalitions, but there's a literature on how collaborations may either fall apart or never get launched when members represent very different agencies, as well as individuals representing classes of people. So this is kind of counter to the idea of forming a collaboration, but we need to be attentive when there are these different and very diverse coalitions. What the literature says is this doesn't necessarily mean it will torpedo a collaboration, but it could take, when we have very diverse coalitions, skilled team leaders and participatory decision making to offset that. So that's just to be careful of if we've got quite diverse people in our collaborations. It would take good leadership skills to kind of counteract that. This is a fundamental issue in the evaluation literature on fidelity to protocol versus adaptation to local needs. Evidence-based programs rest on the assumption that they will be delivered faithful to the description of the curriculum. Yet in communities, they often have to adapt that evidence-based program to local needs. And that's a real serious tension that needs to be navigated in collaborations. We've had discussions in my own experience with my collaborators around how much stretch is there to modify a curriculum until it's not really the actual curriculum that was intended. So that issue is critical to local ownership of the program and sustainability. Something still being discussed in the field. Now for the kind of lived experience. In the academic arena, the tenure and promotion process has usually not given much weight in that process to applied work in the community. It's seen as less than service in some ways. That seems to be changing these days, but there's still some residue around that tenure-lined faculty often will have some hesitation about, am I going to be wasting my time and torpedoing my tenure likelihood if I invest a lot of money in community engagement work? It's just a reality on campus. On the other hand, those in the field, the collaborators, often are extraordinarily busy with their work. And this collaboration for interests of research might be seen as just one more thing they can't take on because they have limited time about it. Another one is, our fealty in the academic arena to journal publications that are in peer-reviewed journals. That's not what our collaborators will read. So I've found it a stretch sometimes in teaching program evaluation and other applied courses where I offer students the option of a translational article assignment where they translate the theory they're learning into something that's consumable by people in the field. And they find it a heavy lift because we have trained them so well to write in an academic way that they're not used to writing for a more applied audience. I think that's another impediment is that we speak different languages, we have different outlets, different priorities. And that goes back to the researcher and the collaborator 101 that would probably benefit from more conversations around that shared language, outlets that might be appealing to both those of us needing it for our resume and those in the field who need the applied research translated into terms that they can use. So that's it for that list, Nate.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I appreciate it. I guess taking a step back and looking at the landscape of Colorado and the opportunities for community university partnerships, what do you see as those opportunities, whether those be topical or structural, for increasing the effectiveness of community university partnerships? And also for all of you who are out in the audience right now, who are your own experts in your own community, let us know in that chat bar too, what you think might be some of the current opportunities for partnerships.
Yeah, thanks, Nate. That one drove me crazy. I could think of 100, but what I did yesterday in prepping for this is I got online and just started doing some searches about what are emerging policy issues in the state of Colorado. And some of them aren't really very amenable to collaborations, at least in our field, like reducing death rates in traffic accidents and stuff like that. My thought was almost any human problem can be addressed with these kind of collaborations. So I was a little bit stumped on how to respond to this. So I'll punt and just say, from my own perspective, anything that relates to individual and family resilience, that encompasses everything from substance use to school success and failure, adolescent pregnancy, delinquency, depression, suicidality, child welfare, maltreatment prevention. All of those fundamentally touch on risk and resilience, which is highly amenable to collaborations. And I know a lot of those issues are especially high on the list of policy and funding initiatives these days, especially in a time of COVID. Civic engagement and community-driven change are the engines of community resilience. That's a new insight to me because I'm only getting familiar with community resilience these days as part of my work with Extension. How to create a more equitable and inclusive society. There's a huge range of things we could be doing in collaboration around that. Community dialogues that translate into concrete actions, advocacy in the policy arena, programs like the Family Leadership Training Institute that create a cadre of leaders. So there are many ways that we can collaborate in addressing those issues. From having public health students in my classes, my grad classes, I know that there's a lot to be done around health and nutrition, specifically both obesity prevention and food insecurity. One of the students in my program evaluation class in the spring was working with local community collaborators in Boulder County around food insecurity and came up with some really great ideas there. Homelessness and relatedly access to mental health services. I'm familiar that with Seattle's kind of not really effective approach to homelessness versus Rhode Island's approach to that, those would involve applied researchers and community collaborators as well. That's just a snippet, but literally there are probably 100 different things that we could be doing, which I think makes for really interesting collaborations, you know, in grant writing, program development, that sort of thing is, and maybe vexatious as well as, man, how do I find a collaborator on this particular issue? But I think there's a lot of potential out there for doing that.
Great, thanks, Dave. Okay, so those were all the prepared questions that we had for Dave today. I think it's probably important that we let you know how you can connect with us. So I've dropped our email addresses, both Dave and my email address, in the chat bar, as well as the Prevention Center general email. So we've entered into the general Q&A session of this webcast. So if you have any other questions that you'd like to ask Dave while we have him, please feel free to drop those in the chat bar. Looks like Carrie might have one, or at least, I don't know if that's a question or a comment. Aging population, yeah, absolutely. We have a number of faculty in HDFS that we partner with around aging and preventive interventions for the aging population. The Grand Cares Project, if some of you are familiar with that. Okay.
Yeah, and on that note, this is a true confessions that when I developed the risk and resilience class for the HDFS grad program, virtually all the literature focused on the first 2 decades of life, you know, the early origins of risk-taking that's manifest in adolescence. And we're a lifespan program in human development and family studies, and I believe it was Ali Brothers who said, Dave, why are you ignoring like the last 6 decades or so of life here when you're talking about resilience? And it really hadn't occurred to me. And my weak excuse was, well, there's no work going on in that, in, you know, adulthood and aging around resilience. She said, oh yeah, you want to bet? Something like that. I'm putting words in her mouth. But, you know, I think we are paying more attention from a resilience lens to the later part of the lifespan. And I don't know of too many applied programs that are addressing that with the later part of the lifespan. I know grandparents raising grandchildren is, for example, because we published an article on grandparents raising grandchildren's resilience recently. But Carrie, your comment about aging is spot on. That would be a very productive area, I think, for applied researchers, especially those in the gerontology area, to work around resilience of older populations. And in rural communities, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I will say that that's an area that the Prevention Research Center is really wanting to move into, given that we have such a just a great core of faculty who are doing research in the later end of the lifespan. And so if that's something that you're interested in connecting with the PRC about, please let us know. That and the developmental disabilities population. These are 2 areas that are of relative strength in the Human Development and Family Studies department, and are also underrepresented in the field of prevention science. And when I'm at national conferences for prevention science, you know, we don't see much there in this developmental disability space or in the aging space. So it's an area that we as a center could really kind of make an innovative splash in the field of prevention science more broadly.
Nicole, yes, I do have a lot of resources on civic engagement, community-driven change. I would recommend that you connect with Patty Schmidt, patty.schmidt, SCHMITT, @colostate.edu. for possible connections around partnerships there. I'm not deferring to her because I'm shifting the burden. It's because she's got such an amazing network. So she would probably be the first point of contact for that around opportunities for partnerships. And I would nominate myself, among others, for an academic applied research collaborator there. I've so enjoyed the partnership around this. It's opened my mind in a lot of ways and gained some skills as well.
Great. Any final lingering questions? Well, if not, if any emerge in the future, feel free to reach out to Dr. MacPhee or myself at the Prevention Research Center. We're happy to connect with you and partner in any ways that could be beneficial to your community organization. Yeah, thanks, Dave. Really informative, and I really appreciate you sitting down with us today.
And Nate, before we log off, well, I have to call you out on something. You said contact Dr. MacPhee. So one thing I always tell my collaborators, you call me Dave or David or hey you or doofus, but please don't call me Dr. MacPhee. That's part of that power differential that I'm really trying to break down. So
yeah, absolutely. It's important to know. Yeah, and likewise, it's Nate, not even Nathaniel here. So feel free to call me Nate. Yeah, we're always willing and looking for opportunities to partner with our community agencies. So thanks for joining us all today.
Thank you.
Enjoy your Friday and have a very nice weekend. We look forward to connecting with you in the future. All right. Take care, everybody.
Giselle, email me. All right. Thank you.